So, ladies and gentlemen, can you all hear me okay on Zoom? Can somebody just give me a thumbs up? Krishnan? Perfect. Sounds great. Wonderful. It's great and an absolute honor to see so many of you tonight as we are starting the RECSAI International Expert Colloquium on AI, and also for my very own inaugural lecture, despite the fact that actually I should have given it 3 years ago, but then came a pandemic that we hadn't planned for and some other things. And now it's time to kind of restart the engines. And I'm really delighted to see so many of my cherished colleagues from along the way, from near and far, here both in the room and on Zoom, from the whole world in fact. And I don't want to spend too much time introducing myself or the speakers. I think we can start right away with our first speaker of the night, the Dean of our law faculty here at European University Viadrina, Professor Ulrich Hacker. Many thanks for kindly agreeing to give this introductory statement. Herr Hacker wird auch zum Teil, glaube ich, auf Deutsch sprechen, so some parts of the remarks might be in German. Mostly the lectures will be in English, and I'm very much looking forward to an intellectual adventure and later on to great conversations between all of us tonight. Thanks for being here.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, als Dekan der Juristischen Fakultät darf ich Sie ganz herzlich begrüßen. Ich freue mich über alle, die gekommen sind, um diese Antrittsvorlesung mitzuerleben. Herr Hacker sagte es schon, dass die Veranstaltung im Wesentlichen auf Englisch stattfinden wird. Deshalb will ich nun auch ins Englische wechseln. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Dean of the Faculty of Law, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all. I particularly welcome those who have come from our partner university in Poznan, from Berlin, or from even more distant places. I hope you found your way here safely. A warm welcome also goes to our colleagues from Pennsylvania who joined us via Zoom. Today we are listening to the inaugural lecture by Professor Hacker. He took over the professorship for Law and Ethics of Digital Society on September 1st, 2020. The pandemic and other reasons have caused this public inaugural lecture to be postponed somewhat. We are all the more pleased that Mr. Hacker will be speaking to us today. Why do you take part in such a lecture? Maybe to learn something and get a little smarter with it. It can even have life-changing effects. Those who know less live less well. The well-known American philosopher John Wayne rightly said, life is hard, it's even harder if you are stupid. Joking aside, a lot of knowledge is required when dealing with AI. But knowledge alone will not be enough. Anyone who wants to deal with AI needs wisdom. This applies to developers as well as users and the state that regulates the use of AI. We hope to gain some of this wisdom from what we will hear tonight. Therefore, we expect that the keynote address and Mr. Hacker's presentation will enrich our lives. Philipp Hacker is a member of the Faculty of Law, but also belongs to the European Youth School of Digital Studies. The ENS is currently a central academic institution of our university under the responsibility of the president. Not only, but also for this reason, I am pleased that we are able to welcome the president, Professor Mühle. And I would now like to ask you, dear Mr. President, for your greetings. Thank you very much indeed.
Dear Professor Hacker.
Thank you. Well, that doesn't work.
Dear Professor Hacker, Dean of our Faculty of Law, dear Professor Passold, Director of the New European School of Digital Studies. Dear guest, and I particularly welcome those following us via Zoom. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to all of you. Welcome to this extraordinary and solemn occasion as we gather to warmly and officially welcome a distinguished scholar to our academic community here at European University Viadrina, Philipp Hacker. Professor Hacker joined our university, as Ulrich already mentioned, in 2020, and since then, taking up his post, he proved to be a highly valued colleague and outstanding expert in his field, contributing remarkably to the reputation of our university. His arrival contributes to the opening of a new chapter in our university's academic journey and is a testament to our commitment to advancing knowledge, fostering an environment where ideas flourish, and cultivating a spirit of intellectual innovation. We acknowledge the global significance of the topics he explores, namely issues related to technologies, law and ethics, and the complexities of their entanglements. His habilitation examines the relationships and tensions between EU data protection law, particularly the General Data Protection Regulation, and other areas of EU and national private law in the context of technological development, and could hardly be more timely. The European AI Act is currently, as we all know, the object of controversy within political bodies in Europe. Civil rights activists believe it isn't efficient enough in terms of data protection, while digital technology companies warn against over-regulating. At a time when the European Union wants to promote the European AI industry while protecting citizens from risky AI applications, Professor Hacker's insights and expertise on the integration of new technologies into European law are of utmost importance. His work underscores the necessity to tailor the law to the capabilities of emerging technologies and of sustainable regulation that is grounded in risk assessment and that ensures transparency and fairness. Today's event also serves as the ceremonial opening of a high-level international expert group in the field of artificial intelligence, the International Expert Consortium for the Regulation, Economics and Computer Science in AI. And I would like to extend a special greeting to the members of this prestigious consortium. As we look to the future, the challenges and opportunities of the digital society are significant and highly dynamic. And it is our task to guide and shape this future in a manner that upholds fundamental rights and contributes to a just digital society. The group's work holds the potential to influence the ethical and legal underpinnings of AI in Europe and on the global scale. The establishment of the expert group, set up jointly with the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, is a fruit of Professor Hacker's efforts and vision, and also of his fruitful collaboration with the Dieter Schwarz Foundation, which generously supports this ambitious undertaking. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the foundation. And I don't know whether any representative of the foundation is present here in the room. Is not the case, but anyway, this is an important collaborative partner, the Dieter Schwarz Foundation, and I would like to extend a warm and thorough thanks for their support. We are very privileged to have Professor Hacker join our academic community at Viadrina, and his inaugural lecture that he is going to give today, entitled Computer Science and Law, Foundations, Applications and Futures, promises to be an enlightened exploration of the complex interplay between technology, law and ethics. I see today's event as an opportunity to learn from a visionary in the field, and I'm now looking very much forward to listen to the insights and ideas he will share with us. Thank you all for joining us as we welcome Professor Hacker at Viadrina, and thank you and enjoy the lecture and the ceremonial foundation of the International Expert Consortium for Regulation, Economics and Computer Science of AI.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for your remarks. Dean, it's wonderful to hear that, in fact, this center, both ENS and RECSAI, have become an integral part, in fact, of Viadrina University, and I'm looking forward really to advancing this union even further throughout the next years. Before I can lay out some ideas of my own in terms of where we can head with respect to law and AI, we will now hear from Sarah Hammer a little bit about the nature, scope, and ambition of RECSAI. So Sarah is my co-lead in the consortium, but she's actually much more than that. She has already been a fellow at ENS, and in fact, this fellowship is also a program that is supported generously by the Dieter Schwartz Foundation, and I should take the opportunity to join our president in thanking the foundation for the generous contributions they have made throughout the last years and will make in the coming years for the benefit of our university. Now, Sarah is executive director at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, which is probably the premier business school in the world. And she has a very rich background in financial regulation. She has served, inter alia, as the acting secretary for banking and finance of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania during the recent banking crisis last year. And she has before worked for the Department of Justice. She's had a prestigious career in private companies and has then joined the Wharton School, not only now as an executive director, but she's also an adjunct professor teaching financial regulation at the Penn Carey Law School. She is more than that, really a wonderful colleague, a perfect person to collaborate with, and I'm so glad to be doing this together with her. So Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to speak a few words at the ceremony. We're excited that you can join us, and certainly sooner rather than later, we will meet you in person here again. Right now, thanks for joining us on Zoom. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Hacker. It's really an honor to speak with all of you today, and I truly wish that I could be there in person. And I look forward to the next opportunity to meet all of you in person. Thank you also, President, and thank you, Dean. It is my honor to be able to speak today and to be able to speak on behalf of Professor Dr. Hacker. I'd like to begin with a bit of a personal note, which is that I had the great honor and pleasure of meeting Professor Dr. Hacker more than 1 year ago. And our collaboration together has spanned not only RECSAI, which we are pleased to launch today, but also our work together at the United Nations in artificial intelligence and our collaboration across a number of issues related to artificial intelligence. And in all of this, I have been astounded at Professor Dr. Hacker's capability, his intellectual prowess, his prolific writing and speaking, and his leadership on many of these topics. It's really an honor to be able to work with him, and I am humbled to be able to speak with all of you today about our work together. So, as was mentioned, we are very pleased to launch the International Expert Consortium on the Regulation, Economics, and Computer Science of AI, RECSAI. which, as Professor Dr. Hacker will speak to, has entailed his vision to provide a platform to facilitate cross-disciplinary inquiries on key questions and challenges related to this important topic of artificial intelligence. The consortium consists of experts from around the globe, many of whom are attending with us today, who are interested in engaging in research, education, thought leadership, and other activities that will shape the evolution of artificial intelligence in our world. RECSAI believes that bringing together these leading thinkers to tackle these important issues surrounding artificial intelligence will drive positive change. The consortium will engage in research, enabling transnational interdisciplinary work through annual conferences and events. And I'm pleased, for example, to mention that we will have a presence, thanks to the generosity of the Dieter Schwartz Foundation, at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, at the United Nations Artificial Intelligence for Good Summit in Geneva in May of 2024, and next year, collaborating with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. in September 2024. These will all be critical events as we work to shape the future of artificial intelligence policy and regulation across national and regional boundaries. We will connect leading AI scholars from various fields and continents, and I would add that Professor Dr. Hacker is the ideal leader to work together on this, as his knowledge and expertise and his reputation spans topics ranging from the financial sector to bias and fairness in artificial intelligence to sustainability. And we will work to promote that global network of scholars and thought leaders that are dedicated to furthering the potential of responsible AI while mitigating its risks. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak about our consortium today. We look forward to working together and with all of you to advance our work in artificial intelligence. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dean Ramaya Krishnan, who is my friend and my colleague here in Pennsylvania, and I've also had the opportunity to get to know over the past several years. Dean Krishnan is the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy Dean at Carnegie Mellon University. He's also the William and Ruth F. Cooper Professor of Management, Science, and Information Systems. He's been a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University since 1988 and was appointed as dean in 2009. Dean Krishnan has an incredible record. He was educated at the Indian Institute of Technology and the University of Texas at Austin. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, a master's degree in industrial engineering and operations research, and a PhD in management science and information systems. He's an expert on digital transformation and has worked extensively with firms and policymakers on using technology and analytics to achieve policy goals. I'll add that I've also had the pleasure of collaborating with Dean Krishnan, not only on work related to artificial intelligence, but on other complex emerging technology issues such as blockchain technology. He is well known for his work in e-commerce and information risk management, where he has made seminal contributions to technology management and policy. And his current research interests not only include the responsible use of AI, but also data-driven approaches to supporting workforce development. Dean Krishnan is a serial academic entrepreneur. He founded the Master of Information Systems and Management program at Carnegie Mellon University and has grown his programs to hundreds of students who are now working in leading technology companies throughout the world. Dean Krishnan has also founded 4 externally funded research centers, raising close to $100 million over the course of the last decade. He directs the Block Center for Technology and Society and advises policymakers, business leaders, and international organizations around the world. Dean Christian, it's really a pleasure to have you with us today. I'm pleased to join you virtually and look forward to seeing you in person in Davos. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. Give me a moment to bring up my presentation. Can you see the presentation? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. So guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. I should say that because I was a Humboldt Stiftung Fellow in the 90s, and it's such a pleasure to be back. I wish I was there with you in Germany, and but it's an honor to be invited to be participating in Professor Hacker's inaugural lecture. What I thought I might do is to talk about generative AI, because it's so relevant to the consortium that Professor Hacker and Ms. Sarah Hammer have founded, which I'm honored to be part of as well. And want to thank Philip and Sarah for their leadership in this very important domain. And it's very timely in terms of both what Professor Hacker has been leading through his own work, but also the convening that he's been doing worldwide through his efforts, and now through the RECSAI efforts that he and Sarah have convened. The focus of my talk today is going to be about some of the key issues related to the governance of generative AI and the issues that arise in measuring it, evaluating it, and how to assure generative AI systems. As Sarah said in this very kind introduction, I lead a center called the Block Center for Technology and Society, which convenes a large number of faculty at Carnegie Mellon in responsible AI. And the work that I'm going to be presenting today is, in addition to my own work, the work of some of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon and work of colleagues at NYU with whom I'm doing some joint work. You're all familiar with the executive order that President Biden signed just a little while ago. And if I were to focus this presentation, because the breadth of issues that arise in generative AI governance is quite large, I thought I'll highlight three things. The first one being the issue of content authenticity. And that is increasingly a very important issue of interest to policymakers because of the fact that, in particular, with elections around the corner in many parts of the world, including the United States, the questions of should there be a synthetic code of conduct? Should there be ways in which we should label content as being AI generated and then have the capacity to let citizens know that they're interacting with AI content is a really important issue that many policymakers worldwide are concerned with. There have been some emergent industry standards in this domain. SynthID from Google is a recent entrant in this space. A recent entrant in this space, as is the C2PA Alliance for Content Provenance. So this issue of synthetic code of conduct and content provenance, as you might imagine, is particularly focused on deepfakes, which has to do with audio and video images, which have been potentially either created by AI or modified by AI. And the question that's of interest to policymakers is, can they require various stakeholders, be they politicians, be they the platforms, be they the model developers, to commit to creating the capability to keep track of content provenance as well as the identification of whether content was AI developed. I will not say much more about that, but rather focus my attention on two issues that have been front and center in this discussion of governance of Gen AI. And that has to do with concerns about AI safety and security. As you're well aware, post the executive order, the US has stood up an AI Safety Institute, and the Bletchley Park announcement from the UK resulted in the UK also setting up an AI Safety Institute. And a big focus of these institutes has been in terms of identifying what kind of pre-deployment activities does one have to engage in to try and provide as much assurance about the models that are going to be deployed. As I'll show you in just a minute, while the conceptual frameworks are in place and there are several tools out there, there's a lot that we need to do to learn how to measure, how to evaluate, and how to assure generative AI systems pre-deployment. The second piece of what I'm going to focus on is a major focus of our activity, which has to do with, despite all the due diligence you might actually engage in, once models are deployed, you will find that there are still vulnerabilities and failures that emerge, and we need a mechanism for addressing them quickly. And I'll speak to a potential approach that has been modeled after what was built for information security or cybersecurity that is now being adapted to the needs of AI. So our focus in the next 10, 15 minutes is going to be what could be done about pre-deployment and post-deployment. So as I go along, I'm going to use some terms. The first is that I'll draw a distinction between trying to evaluate and assure and govern AI models, and draw the distinction between models versus systems. Because if you think of a system that makes a decision, it might have model components in it, but the world cares about the systems and the outputs of the system and the potential harms that it might cause. You certainly want to understand the components that make up the system, but it's important not to only focus on the components, we need to focus on the system as well. The second is to draw a distinction between model developers, and these are potentially the usual suspects. You might think about the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Anthropics, and versus the model deployers. There's a small number of model developers, particularly closed model developers, and then a really large number of model deployers. So that distinction, and I'll focus primarily on model developers in the pre-deployment discussion. The third important concept is this concept of black box versus white box testing of models. I won't drill down too much into this, but it's important for us to keep in mind that many of the models that you currently have access today, you don't really know what data went into them. You don't have complete access to the model themselves. You have what's called API-based access to the models. So you're able to provide inputs and obtain outputs, but that's the extent of the engagement and interaction you have with them. And the question is, what kind of assurance can you provide with that level of access? In contrast to that, you might have completely open source models where you might know everything about the training data, the models themselves, and the code that was used to develop the models. That would be considered white box. And in between, there are different you could have gray box models like Llama 2, for instance. You don't have data about what training data went into the models, but you know the models and the weights themselves. Finally, there are tools out there for holistic evaluation of these large language models, tools like LL.M from Stanford. But I'll be focused in particular on understanding how to evaluate the deployment of these models in particular domains. These are domain-specific applications, like in healthcare or hiring, which I'll use as examples. Okay, with that as set up, let's dive right in. So let's talk about pre-deployment AI safety and security. The two main concepts that I'd love for you to take away from this presentation is that what we'd like from the standpoint of model transparency is that much like we keep track of nutrition labels that are associated, let's say, with a bottle of juice or with a can of anything you buy in a grocery store, where we know what went into the production of that can of juice or what it is you're buying in that grocery store. Can we have detailed nutrition labels of what went into the AI models? And can these inputs, can they be potentially be audited for compliance, not only with data ownership, such as IP and copyright? Could they have been subjected to bias analysis so that we know there was structural bias analysis done of the data that went into the model? And where they also potentially checked for adversarial data poisoning attacks. Each of these are kinds of issues that one thinks about when you want to think about the data that went into the model, because what often happens with the outputs that come from a model go back to what went into the model. So it's important to think about governance that will require model developers to disclose what went into the model, particularly for safety critical and high risk applications. The second is on the output side, we'd like the equivalent of an underwriter's lab that provides assurances with regard to how reliable the model is or how safe the model is with respect to a set of standards. Now, much like in financial statement analysis, you have the generally accepted accounting principles. Here, you'd like to have the capacity to provide this kind of assurance with respect to standards that are set. And today, we don't have those. So we don't have the equivalent of the so-called GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, for AI in particular use cases, like in healthcare, in hiring, in autonomous vehicles. What's the acceptable rate of error that is considered acceptable for these applications? The AI risk management framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology potentially provides a mechanism, a framework for specifying what those should be through what are called profiles, but we don't have those in place, and I think a public-private approach might well be necessary to create those profiles. So with that as context, what I'm going to do is focus in particular on a couple of examples. In the interest of time, I'm going to provide a way I think about how one should develop AI systems. And one designs AI systems to flow from values that we hold to be important. And these values then get implemented by designers into the system. So if you think about what those values might be, here are some examples of values that a large number of societies widely subscribe to: fairness, efficiency, robustness, transparency, etc. So you'll notice that oftentimes when people talk about AI systems as maximizing a single objective function, one should take a step back and ask the question, should it be really a multi-criteria objective function that one should think about, where you're trying to really be on an efficient frontier rather than just maximize one objective function, like minimizing loss, for instance, which most AI systems currently focus on. I'll focus on two exemplars. I'll look at inclusiveness and fairness to illustrate this, to give you a little more concrete example. So here is an example of a patient health literacy application, where a patient is looking to extract a video from a video archive. Imagine going to the equivalent of a ChatGPT or a Bard, where you could put in a prompt asking for a video for how to use an insulin pen to give yourself a shot if you're a diabetic. And what are the kinds of criteria you would like for that video to subscribe to? Well, you would really like this to be not only of high quality, so there should not be misinformation or disinformation related to this diabetic video, but it should also be understandable. And it should be understandable potentially by somebody with an 8th grade education. Should not have very high levels of sophistication in explaining what this is about. So you could imagine if you have a framework for evaluating understandability of a video, and you have frameworks for assessing quality of videos, which can be quantified, then you could build AIs that could actually classify if a given video is understandable and is actually can actually be engaged with by somebody in this target audience. That's the example of being inclusive, because you're taking into account people with different education levels and enabling them to access this kind of content. With respect to fairness, I'm going to use a hiring example. So this is work, for instance, that we have been doing in trying to understand systemic kinds of error and the kinds of false positive rates and false negative rates that arise when you're trying to use large language models for assessing the fit of a given resume to a given job description. This is done with data that we have that has been labeled data, where we know what actually happened to a given resume when somebody applied for a given job. So given this label data, how well does the AI do in terms of how well does it do and what errors does it commit? Commit errors of omission as well as errors of commission. So the details of this are not important, but what I'd like to do is to give you an instance of something like this, which is being able to provide a very simple prompt of this sort, where you're asking if a given resume and a job description and asking the question, give me a yes or no as to whether this candidate resume is a good fit for this particular job description. Now, you could imagine more sophisticated prompts that improve the quality of the response that the large language model might give you. This work we did was with a relatively small language model. This is the Llama 2 7 billion parameter model. But it gives you a flavor for how to evaluate these models in terms of the expected type of predictive capability, the kinds of errors. The FNs and the FPs here correspond to false negatives and false positives. The important thing to keep in mind is, imagine if I was a firm and I was using this kind of AI, if I accepted an applicant that wasn't a good fit, then I've essentially incurred a cost by interviewing an applicant that I otherwise would not want to interview. In contrast, a false negative corresponds to my not seeing a candidate that would have actually been a good candidate for me to interview. This is a problem. This is a loss to society and also to the individual. So one of the things that we are particularly concerned about are false negatives, because the cost of false negatives falls on the individual. And if there are systemic errors where the same individual applies to multiple jobs in different firms, all using the same generative AI, and gets denied at every one of those firms, that represents a systemic error that you would like to avoid. So this is this question of how do you deal with false positives and false negatives, and who bears the cost of these errors, are really important and relevant issues in understanding pre-deployment evaluation of generative AI. I know it's gone through relatively quickly, but I hope the main ideas are clear, that we need measurement as to what it is we are seeking to measure, how are we evaluating it, and then if we have to assure that the system is good enough, what are we assuring it against? And that's really what the key ideas I wanted to convey are. Now, let's switch to post-deployment, where I just want to give you a very simple example, where the idea is that in 1988, there was a worm called the Morris worm that wreaked havoc on the internet. And that resulted in the Department of Defense standing up something called the CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, that would allow for individuals to report all kinds of errors and software vulnerabilities to this institution, which would then do forensic analysis of those vulnerabilities to risk tier them, and then have the software developers develop patches to actually fix the vulnerabilities that were so identified. The idea here is to do exactly the same with AI systems. Let me give you an example of what such an error or a vulnerability might look like. So this is the work of my colleague, Matt Fredrickson. And if you go to ChatGPT, and I'll use a very simple, funny example, and you ask it, insult me. I don't know how many of you have tried this. You should try it. If you say insult me, it'll politely decline to insult you because it says I'm here to provide helpful and respectful assistance, etc. You could also ask it to build a bomb. You could say, tell me what to do to build a bomb, and it'll decline. However, the suffix attack is one where you're able to get outside the guardrails that have been built by following that insult me prompt with a bunch of nonsense strings. And those nonsense strings are not random nonsense. They've actually been created through machine learning to adversarially exploit the guardrail that was built into ChatGPT. We actually did this work with Llama 2 initially, but we're amazed that the same attack that created the guardrail to be violated with Llama 2 also violated the guardrails in ChatGPT, also the one in Bard, also the one in Claude. In other words, this was a systemic error that spanned all large language models. So it's an example of a vulnerability that had not been caught pre-deployment, but was caught post-deployment. This is called a suffix attack. And the idea here is to find a universal attack that breaks multiple large language models. And what this then allows us to do is to use the same idea with the so-called black box models that I talked about early on. And you could see that this is very successful with all the commercially widely used models. So what's the big takeaway from this? The takeaway from this is that we need post-deployment capability to rapidly respond to vulnerabilities, do the kind of vulnerability analysis and situational awareness and forensic analysis to do exactly what we did with information security to build through a closed feedback loop a much safer system. So let me close then with the following ideas. That one, there's a lot of excitement about the frontier AI models. There's amazing kinds of capabilities they bring to the table. However, there's a lot to be learned about how to measure, evaluate, and assure them. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. And that's why I think these safety institutes are particularly interesting. I'm speaking to you from Singapore, where I'm at a Singapore convening on AI, where these questions of reliability and trustworthiness are really important issues. And this multidisciplinary approach that Professor Hacker has pioneered at the nexus of law, social science, engineering, and computer science are very, very essential to respond to this challenge. So I'm really excited that he's not only going to be speaking to us shortly, but also has created this RECSAI initiative that's convening multidisciplinary scholars to address this challenge. So thank you again for this opportunity. And thank you, Philip, to have me be part of your really important event and day. And congratulations again.
Thank you so much, Krishnan, for this exciting and really insightful lecture. I mean, we were all waiting, of course, for the results of the insult jailbreak. Maybe you want to share them later on. I would have loved a video.
That'll be a private session.
All right. That will be for the after show. Okay, great. So thank you so much for joining us all the way from Singapore. It's particularly exciting to have Krishnan speak about, the executive order of President Biden, because he, in fact, is a member of the National AI Advisory Council that has been convened by the U.S. president. And actually, we have 4 of their members who are part of the RECSAI network, including Miriam Vogel, who's the chair. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Thanks so much, Krishnan, and I'm very much looking forward to having this private session with you in Davos when you're going to show me all of the results of your exciting research on insulting expertise. Now, with that said, I would like to ask on stage my dear colleague, friend, and partner in crime, let's say, Jan-Hendrik Passert, who is not only the, can we say director or director, I'd say, of the ENS, of our European New School of Digital Studies, but also the vice president for research of our university. Jan, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for giving a few add-on remarks. And then after that, we will have a short hopefully lecture by myself. And if you know me, you know that I usually speak very shortly. So thanks so much for coming here, Jan.
Thank you very much, dear Philip, dear Mr. President, dear Dean, dear colleagues overseas and in the room, dear students also. Happy to see you all here. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to this important academic event that an inaugural lecture is. An inaugural lecture usually is a step towards becoming a real academic, one could say. But of course, that's hard to say in the case of Philipp Hacker, not only because of the fact that this event should have taken place 3 years ago, and it's hard to actually do an Antritt if you already had stepped into the position and played such a big role in shaping the ENS's and this university's future already. Also, let me say that instead of giving introductory remarks and welcomes, I would love to start discussing specifically with Dean Krishan about the topics he just highlighted and laid out. And I'm really happy that I have the chance to be part of the RECSAI network, so we can extend those discussions to further meetings over the next years, specifically on, as a sociologist by training, I'm really interested in how to actually build those institutional setups and audit structures that would let us implement such measurements and such safety measurements as well. As I said, it's hard to say this is an Antrittsvorlesung. It's probably more of an academic event, a lecture, an intellectual experience that we are going to experience later on. And thank you, Dean Krishan, already for highlighting my most important point that I wanted to bring to this table, namely that the fact that we are in these highly technological times living with at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different ways of shaping our socio-technical futures. The law, on the one hand, as the core procedure and the core field of building normative expectations and its regulatory, let's say, texts and institutions that create not only the world we live in, but also the world we want to live in potential futures. But we're also building the technology that is, let's say, under the hood, already shaping the way we live, the way we deal, the way we hire people, the way we work. And now we're living in a world where the shaping of our socio-technical futures is only to be done in connection of the law and technical expertise. And thank you very much for already showing us what types of knowledges are necessary to actually bring those questions together. A deep understanding of the regulatory frameworks in which our current European societies are flourishing, on the one hand, but also an in-depth understanding, at least of the mathematics and the technical details of those machine learning models and large language models Philipp is so keen on working with. There's no way of tackling these questions without at least understanding partially what each of these fields of knowledge would bring. And I know not no better person than to do this actually than my colleague Philipp Hacker, which I now present to you and hand over. And I'm happy to have you here as an esteemed colleague, but also, as I might say, an academic friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Philipp Hacker.
Thank you so much, Jan. Wonderful to hear your thoughts about the multidisciplinary necessities and enterprise that we're launching both in the RECSAI framework and more broadly also at ENS and at Viadrina at large. So let me just try to pull up my presentation here for a second, and then we can go right ahead with some brief thoughts on the law and computer science field that I'm working on. But before we do this, I would like to highlight that I'm not generally a pretty traditional fellow, I like to say, but this is a cherished and venerable academic tradition, and I'm really happy to be part of it and to have opted for this inaugural lecture, which comes with, of course, traditional experiences, with traditional expectations, and also with reflecting upon the own tradition that you stand in. And so before I start, I just wanted to give a very brief note of thank you to my family, first and foremost, my own family. And unfortunately, my father can't be here tonight because he's, as so many other colleagues, sick at the moment. But my family also, of course, my wife, kids are at home, for God's sake. And it's great to have you, to have my back, and I wouldn't be here without you. And I don't mean this in a physical sense. Also, of course, it's brilliant to see my academic family here. We have the extended academic family, let's say, within ENS and Viadrina, but more specifically, of course, I'm referring to my early on mentors and supervisors. And first and foremost, there is Klaus Haupt, who is one of the most distinguished lawyers in Germany. He used to be the director of the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg for private international law. He was the vice president of the DFG for law for a long time. And I met him early on. I had the privilege to meet him early on in my studies. And for many of the decisive moments in my life, academically, I was able to lean on him and to have his ear to decide, for example, between two mediocre universities on the East Coast that often spar in football games. And he gave me brilliant advice each and every time. And it's been such a pleasure to be guided by you along this journey. Thank you so much. And then also, of course, sitting next to him, his own former student, postdoc student, and his own mentee, Stefan Grundmann. And in fact, it was Klaus who told me one day, well, if you ever want to, write a PhD with a really smart and nice guy, go see Stefan. And that's what I did when I was actually in Israel, thinking about, at the end of my referendariat, thinking about where to go, whether to go back to Munich or remain in Berlin. And then I had met this lady in Berlin, and I thought maybe, we want to try some people in Berlin, but I hadn't studied there and knew nobody. So I just looked through the list of professors at HU and FU, and I saw, hey, there's this guy, Stefan Grundmann. I think he was mentioned one day by Klaus. So I just rang him up, and that's where it got started. And I'm really so happy about, having found you as a mentor and a friend. Stefan, it couldn't have been better. It was really a perfect match. And thank you so much for all your support along these years. Having said this, there's, of course, in every tradition, some kind of future. And that future is what I want to talk to you today about, but not without heeding the advice of those two mentors that they gave me along the way for my presentation. So Klaus always said, you got to be strong in doctrinal law, but also you need to have that interdisciplinary component. And then Stefan came along and said, wait a sec, interdisciplinarity, that's not only law and economics, it's actually many disciplines. So try to be multidisciplinary. And then I had a third piece of advice from one of my mentors at Yale, Ian Ayres, who said, be bold, make a claim. So I'll try to connect these three things and in my hopefully short presentation. And bear with me before you head out for the buffet. All right, so let's get started and try to see a little bit or peer a little bit into what I think could be potential future or futures of the interaction between law and computer science. And as we approach this complicated topic, I think it's useful to do this in 3 steps. So first, try to lay some foundations and inquire into whether and why at all we should look at law and computer science more particularly. And then in the second step, I will highlight some specific applications and challenges, and particularly in the field of sustainability. And finally, I'll try to map out some paths forward for how we can fruitfully or less fruitfully engage with this within this multidisciplinary exercise. All right, so let's get started right away and ask ourselves, why in the world should law and computer science be, the new best friends, or are they rather faux amis? Sorry. And this is, of course, DALL-E 3 generated image. And I just asked DALL-E 3 to show me an image of AI is everywhere. And it looks futuristic, but if you look closely, it's actually not very futuristic. It's, you might say, unfortunately, pretty realistic. It's perhaps not Frankfurt Oder, but, soon enough. There's a smart city initiative underway, under the auspices of Jürgen. And nevertheless, I don't know how to get this thing away. Oh, well, whatever. So, the idea being that AI is, of course, a new cross-cutting element that you see in all kinds of fields and features in all parts of the city and our lives, not only in business. And it's something that increasingly we cannot escape from. Even if you don't like it, even if you don't understand it, you're not going to get away from it. And that's why it's so crucial, I think, to think very hard about how we can shape this world with the law that we have at hand and the law that we can aspire to. So my first bold claim would be that computer science and law, or law computer science, could be the new law in economics. And if you have any idea of the law, then you might know that actually the big paradigm in interdisciplinary research and the law, at least in private law for a long time, has been precisely law and economics. And what's the difference here, or why do I think there is an important future for law and computer science? Well, law and economics has been challenged along the way many times because of the inherent normative foundations that are linked intrinsically to welfare economics, to a normative conception of social welfare that relies on efficiency maximization, wealth maximization. That is attractive to some, but certainly not all members of society and academia. We might think at first blush that computer science fares better along this metric because you might think that, it's more neutral. It's just measurement, it's just computation. And actually, when I talk to the media or politicians, sometimes we still get this, I will try to show that that's actually not the case, but it's probably normatively much more amenable, much more formidable than economics has ever been. And the interesting part is also that we can see data-driven experiments taking over from lab experiments that we know from law and economics. And that is an exciting new component where we can actually try to measure large parts of what's being done. We did a study, for example, with Zalando, where we collected 80,000 data points and analyzed them in novel ways. And this is something that earlier on was just not possible. And it allows a kind of granularity that was unseen before, but it also showcases some of the dangers because, of course, you might also say that this comes precisely from the kind of surveillance architecture that is inherent to this framework. And there is a second motif that I want to mention, and I think that's really important not to underestimate. Last Thursday, I believe, we inaugurated here at Viadrina the Viadrina Center for Polish and Ukrainian Studies. And this is a new flagship institution or center that will shape the research and policy field along many dimensions in an increasing and complex geopolitical environment. What does AI have to do with this? I would like to say a lot, because actually large language models are large because they have a lot of parameters, and usually you'd say more than 10 billion. Well, Christian just experimented with some of these smaller language models, the 7B model, the Llama 7B, which is a smaller, medium-sized, let's say, language model. But anybody know how much parameters ChatGPT has? Make a guess. It's 175 billion. And that's on the lower end, you know. So if you have Google Palm, that's 540 billion. And for GPT-4, we don't know it because they don't disclose it. They're precisely not doing what Krishna wants them to do, to bring out these model cards. But it's very likely north of 1 trillion parameters. So you need lots of parameters, loads of training data, and you need massive amounts of compute. And that's the problem, because we have a real bottleneck here. And if you look at the figures from 2022, up until 2022, and I can tell you it has not improved since then, 73% of the models were designed or developed by US companies, mostly companies, not academic institutions. That's also a note of concern. 15% in China, and that's much underreported because there's a lot happening in the military. And that leaves, you know, mathematically, because something is happening also in the United Arab Emirates and in the rest of Southeast Asia, less than 10% for the European Union. And if we think of our complex geopolitical environment where AI, for example, is increasingly used in military context, where it is used for disinformation campaigns, where we have hybrid threats and attacks, this is really worrying. And when I show this slide to EU policymakers, that's when they start listening up and, you know, put away their smartphones. As maybe some of you are doing, because, you know, that's when they see that we have another kind of vulnerability there today. We've seen this with oil and gas, but that's our new oil and gas problem, because China is unreliable, and the US is not a partner really anymore, because if you think of Trump potentially regaining presidency in 2025, he might just say, you know, get out of Ukraine, stop the help, or else I will just cut down the APIs. You just don't have access to these models anymore. He could do that. And knowing Trump, that's not something that would be totally off his wish list. So, you know, that's why I think we need more independence here. And we need certainly in Europe, digital sovereignty, which is something that is really stressed in many circles. And I've recently been to a meeting of NATO officials and US Homeland Security scholars and people from the administration, and that was the #1 topic, really. But the problem being that this connects deeply with the geostrategic shift that we're seeing along our eastern borders, and that's why it's so important to have both the digital framework here and the Ukrainian and Polish center at Viadrina. We can try to bring these things together. All right. Third point, very briefly, is that I think it's important to think about two-way learning processes. So we have AI and the law, and obviously the law has something to say about AI. You know, AI needs to be compliant. That's pretty clear if you don't want to run into trouble. But also, technology or regulation itself should be aware of the technologies. For example, when you talk about frontier AI regulation, as Krishnan has just done, it's really important, as also Jan stressed, to have an idea of and to be even, you know, to be not only aware, but also cognizant of specific attributes and facts of these models that distinguish them from other models. And also, if we think about enforcement, there's a lot of lag in enforcement around the world, particularly when it comes to the GDPR. And for example, there's this program called MAPS. It was developed by US researchers, and it just analyzed over 1 million apps on the I believe, Apple App Store, and checked basically the data policies that it automatically analyzed with the data flows that were really coming out of these models, and try to match them, and saw that, you know, in many of these apps, actually there are data flows that are not disclosed in the privacy policies, mostly to third-party vendors. And you cannot do this humanly. But if you have a model that's doing this with 1 million apps, they partner with the FTC, which is one of the privacy regulators in the US, and then the FTC used it to go after some of the guys they would never have otherwise caught. So that's really an, I think, important dimension going forward in teaming up between law and AI. But in my application scenarios, I want to show you that this is still not enough. Why this? I think there are, from my point, at least 3 really major future AI regulatory fields that I want to work on, that I am already working on to a certain extent, and that I think are relevant to our societies. One is the non-discrimination data protection problem that Christian has already talked about. And that is something that is really a new problem in many respects, as I shall try to tell you in just a few minutes, when it comes to generative AI systems. The other problem is the public safety dimension, the fact that you can actually use these models for good and bad. They're true dual use goods, I believe. You can use them to, optimize healthcare systems. And my sister, she works at a hospital in the south of Germany, and every time I meet her, she tells me how much and dearly they really need AI to come along, because it would just, keep people from dying. And it's a very good hospital. But on the other hand, you can use it to actually plan your next bioterror attack. And I know people who are doing this kind of research, and they have engaged in tests, and it's very worrying to see what they're finding. And that's why this is high on the radar of national security scholars, and where the geopolitical dimensions come in. But what I want to talk about to you today is sustainability, because that's one of the other big, of course, societal challenges. It's also one of the other core dimensions that we want to tackle here at Viadrina, and at the law faculty more specifically also. And I have a paper that's forthcoming in the Common Market Law Review. And I just want to show you some glimpses of what I have tried to uncover there. It's still, I'm still revising the last pages. So if you have any comments, I can directly put this in the manuscript. So bear with me for 5 more minutes or so. Why is this important? I think this is the next really frontier, because we have here a simplified model of a deep neural network that is pretty good at distinguishing cars from persons or animals. And that's of course important if you want to go for example, autonomous vehicles going forward. It's important if that thing crashes into a person or an animal. But an increasing number of scholars, particularly in computer science, ask themselves the question what the costs are that these models are bringing to the planet, and whether climate change is not only potentially mitigated, but also spurred on by AI. Why is this? We have seen that there is a strong interrelationship between AI and the law. There's obviously a lot of climate change law and environmental law that has been built for the last couple of decades. But there's fairly little research, but it's a highly promising field where many young scholars are flocking to look at the interaction between AI and climate. And I think that's one of the triangles that we have to square, kind of, in order to go forward with meaningful solutions. Why is this important or relevant? If you look at the climate effects, the GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions more particularly, of ICT, that's information and communication technology in general, and AI in particular, you will find that according to estimates, already now, the GHG emissions of ICT in general are in the range of global air travel, in fact, likely higher. And we talk about, reducing air travel all the time, and people have to, when you go on a research visit, you try to use a ship or something, which is all fine to me, but you're doing that while using an AI-powered engine to actually showcase your results, and that might counteract some of the train riding that you engage in. In fact, if you look at AI more specifically, the costs are skyrocketing. In the last couple of years, there's estimates that say it has been raised by a factor of 300,000. And in fact, a new study shows that by the year 2027, it will have, on a medium track, that's not even the highest adoption track, on a medium track, it will have the GHG emissions of the country like Argentina. And that is, of course, something that is worrying, And at the same time, of course, there are vast opportunities for climate change mitigation using AI. And there's people who, is Jan in the audience and others who are actually working on this. But let's not forget that, again, this is a dual-edged sword. So those are the kinds of things that we lawyers actually love, because that's a regulatory problem. It's not that it's only just good for society. Well, in that case, lawyers aren't really needed. Neither is it just purely bad and we have to ban it. That would be something for criminal law. But rather, it's somewhere in the middle, and we want to regulate it smartly. But so far, unfortunately, the sustainability dimension, the climate dimension of AI is entirely overlooked in regulation. I'm just going to show you real briefly how this and why this is the case. You might first look at environmental law and think, environmental law, that's where climate change is being dealt with in the law. So maybe there's something to learn from environmental law, or at least it will cover some aspects of AI. And in fact, AI, as I said, not only has these vast GHG emissions, but also the water consumption is really extreme in many cases. a medium length conversation, actually quite a long, like 30 to 50 questions, back and forth between ChatGPT and a user consumes. Does anybody have an idea how much water that consumes? Any guesses? That's a single conversation. Well, the estimate is that it consumes, actually, how much is this here? This is 300, so it's half a liter, so it's more than this. So that's a single conversation, lengthy conversation, but nonetheless. So if you think about, upward of 100 million users, they're consuming this much of water, and water being an increasingly scarce resource, not only in deserts, but also here. You think of Brandenburg, think of basically almost any country. This is a problem. So there is the emissions trading system that has been installed in the EU. There's the Water Framework Directive, and if you didn't know it, it's worth looking it up. I looked it up for my research, and it's surely beautiful, as many of these acts are that come from the EU. But I did not find anything that actually resembles anything, covering AI. Well, then I double-checked in textbooks. I spoke to environmental scholars, and it's true. It's just not covered. The Water Framework Directive, to a certain extent, yes, you could say that it applies to some facilities that are being built, like data centers. But the emissions trading system comes actually from the beginning of the 2000s, and it focuses on these high emission technologies, like steel or production or transport, aviation, maritime transport. There is just nothing about it that relates to AI. And with the curve going upward, that's, I think, a problem. So we need kind of an environmentally aware, climate-specific evolution of AI regulation, but not only in environmental law, but more generally in the EU regulatory framework, because there are multiple instruments that we can try to bring together and piece together something that could be a comprehensive approach to this problem. So then I turn to the GDPR, because the GDPR, well, it's always fun, I guess. All of my students know this. And also, it's a big win, of course, because the GDPR is a framework that really has power, a lot of enforcement power. And so you might think, well, if there's something in the GDPR, that'd be really great, because many of the big cases in labor law these days are won through the GDPR. Look at the Uber case, for example. However, sustainability, unfortunately, despite the fact that this is actually from 2016, still conspicuously absent. No mentioning of the concept of sustainability. Why is that? Well, the GDPR, I think, and here's another, it's not really bold, but it's a claim. It focuses very specifically on the data subject controller relationship. So it means basically here's myself as a data subject, here's a data controller, might be Google, might be whoever, and it focuses on this dyadic, this bilateral relationship of my individual rights vis-a-vis that controller, the duties of that controller, but it neglects the entire framework around it. So if we want to try to reinterpret the GDPR, we need to take these concerns into account. And the question is, can we do this? And if yes, how? So this is what I try to explore a little bit in the paper. And to give you a short version of, a snapshot version of this, basically what I suggest is that we look at key concepts of the GDPR and try to reinterpret them in the light of environmental considerations, not in not in an ideological fashion, trying to impose something that wouldn't belong there, but rather to say, if we consider legitimate interests along a whole range of issues, then please let's not forget about the most pressing concern that we have as mankind or humankind, and that is climate change. So here's the norm. As in every legal tort, you need at least one direct quote from the law, of course. So this is, again, from the full beauty of the GDPR, processing being necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interests pursued by the controller or by a third party, except where such interests are overridden by the interests of the data subject. Basically, the idea is you can process data even if there is no consent if the interests of the data controller, say Facebook, and presenting me targeted advertising are more important or not overridden by my interests in having my data safeguarded. And the interesting fact is that if you look closely, it's a legitimate interest by the controller or by a third party. So it could also be somebody else that comes to the rescue of the controller for processing this. But there's no equivalent on the other side. It's just the data subject. And I stumbled upon this actually in my habilitation work, and I thought, this is crazy. Why is this so? Nobody could answer that question, so I think it's just crazy, it's just wrong. And when something is crazy and wrong, lawyers usually try to get around it somehow. And there's these doctrinal mechanisms. So what I propose is to extend this to take into consideration collective interests, and actually both ways. So you could say if something is particularly good for societal interest, say you're doing data processing precisely to mitigate climate change or do some other, societally beneficial work, then that should count in favor of the processing, of course, but also the other way around, if it's really detrimental, then it should count against it. And that could be, for example, data processing for a coal plant that even if it has been approved, you could think of whether there might be some countervailing legitimate interests of society against it. And that's an intricate discussion to have to the extent to which, if this has been approved, we can, still go beyond this approval process and so on and so forth. Administrative lawyers such as Mr. Hacker would be more qualified to talk about this than I am. I just want to suggest that there are ways of rethinking the framework of the GDPR and of other norms in this context. Here's a second example. This is a really cool book. It's called Delete, and it was written by Victor Meyer-Schönberger in the year of, it was published in 2009, and it basically kind of invented the right to be forgotten, which is a key framework of the EU data protection framework. It's now called the right to erasure. We now have it in the GDPR. But there might be a conflict between the right to erasure and environmental sustainability. How that? Well, if you think about the following case, there is, let's say, an AI model that has been trained on vast amount of data, and the data was presumably anonymized. So people thought, we can train with this because the data protection framework does not apply. If something is anonymized, data protection framework doesn't apply. Now here comes along a new technology for de-anonymizing data, and this is actually what's happening all the time. You don't have to think about quantum computing, which is a major challenge there, but just general, new techniques are being discovered every day as we speak. And then it turns out this data set wasn't anonymized. It can actually, people can be re-identified. So then, some grandmother or grandfather thinks about, this is kind of unfair. This is really bad. I don't want my data in there. I've heard about this right to erasure funny thing, so I want to exercise my right. Please delete this. And then they say, well, I can delete this, but, it's already, of course, it's in the model, but, you certainly don't have a problem with this. And then she says, well, if it's in the model, no, of course not. Then the model has to be deleted too. And then you might say, well, that's, that goes a little far. But then you ask some experts, some of the leading experts that we convened in Geneva for our conference. And here comes Michael Veal, and here come Lillian Edwards. And Lillian is, I believe, on the call. Hi, Lillian. Great to have you with us. She's also a RECSAI member. And, leading experts tell us, well, this is not very far-fetched. In fact, you may have to delete the model because the model includes and encapsulates these training data. Now, the problem being, of course, that this model has been trained, and this is super climate intensive. So if you retrain the model, you have perhaps the environmental costs of the whole city of Munich, or another beautiful place in Germany, in the entire year. So is that worth it? And oftentimes, we lawyers, we say, well, it's kind of a balancing thing. It's like there's countervailing interest and we try to balance things. Unfortunately, there is no general balancing element in Article 17 where the right to erasure is located now. You can refuse to erase, but only if this is a matter of public health or archiving or research, but not for environmental reasons. As we noted already, sustainability is conspicuously absent. But the CJU brings some hope here. And the CJU, in its Google Spain case, the famous case that actually legally invented the right to be forgotten, said, well, the societal dimensions, they do count. They have to be taken into account in what was then conceived of as a major balancing exercise between competing fundamental rights. And this now has been put into the GDPR in a much more restrained framework. So the question is, can we reimagine this kind of balancing exercise that the CJU did within the framework of the GDPR? And I would say yes. And I don't think it's a particularly bold claim to make, but I think it's a new claim. And we can say that, for example, if you trained a large model for a particularly societally beneficial cause, such as detecting cancer, And then comes along, people like myself who are privacy activists saying, hey, please delete this. There's unfortunately, and we can now re-identify myself. Then I would say, do weigh this against this, the environmental costs and the cost of, perhaps not being able to use a model. And that might lead to the conclusion that in these cases, other than we thought before, actually there is no right to erasure. That's not the whole story, though, however. I would say that, of course, you need additional safeguards. You cannot just say, well, there's no erasure. There's other rules, like Article 22 in the GDPR, which, as all of my students know, contains what? Any students around here? Now, we're not gonna have a second reading of text. And it concerns some rules on. I see some students there. Well, we talk about this later. No wine for you during the first 10 minutes of the buffet. What did I say? Okay, so what we have to do basically is to say we take Article 22, which allows or which has a prohibition on using automated decision-making systems, but it allows it under certain circumstances. So basically takes away the user right, but then gives additional safeguards, such as a right to right to explanation, or not a right to explanation, but at least some contestation and intervention of human beings. So I think by analogy we could say we transplant these safeguards, but we still find a broader approach to thinking about the differences or the countervailing and interesting trade-offs between individual rights that have been, I would say, almost treated as almost fetishized in the recent years, and the collective interest, and that's a much broader conversation to be had. So the upshot is some interpretation is possible along environmental domains when it comes to AI regulation and the law in key concepts, but that might also lead to the limitation of some of the rights that we thought we could take for granted along many dimensions. And still, there's no comprehensive strategy within the GDPR or elsewhere to tackle AI's environmental footprint. So maybe we could ask, does the AI trilogue, I guess my time is up. Does the AI Act help? And for the last couple of weeks, I've worked on the AI Act so much. I've been more in policy advice than in research, actually. I want this to change tonight. So I'm not going to comment on this much. I'm just going to say this is all at risk. It's being decided tomorrow, by the way. So it's a timely intervention, and I hope some of the folks are listening. I sent the link to them at the European Parliament. And so my idea is to go forward by saying, we need to bridge IT law and environmental law by providing transparency, by addressing questions such as sustainability by design, and by consumption caps, perhaps even. And this is the bold claim, incentivizing GHG emissions limits that might include saying, we have aviation that's covered, and we have another sector that is potentially as disruptive to the environment as aviation, and that is AI or ICT more generally. And I think we should think about including this in the EU emission scheme. But the problem for this is, and now we come to the real interdisciplinary context, is that there is deep challenges in how to measure this. It's very difficult when you think about foundation models to actually map the emissions of specific models onto specific use cases. It's very difficult to think about this in ways of, I'm going to leave this aside, but it's very difficult to think about this on a process level basis, where you actually measure the individual contribution of AI to a specific system, whilst it is much easier to do this on a system level of the entire application. I actually have a research project that I'm starting with Ralf Herbrich, who is a professor for AI and sustainability at the Hasso-Plattner Institute, and we just discussed this at length, and he is a specialist in measuring this, and he said, yeah, at the moment it's impossible. It's just impossible to measure. And nemo tenetur, as we say, so it's difficult to force people to do something that's impossible. But still, we can try to think about ways to come up with measurement techniques, just like Ramaya said, and we can then apply them, this whole scheme, this whole framework, to other sectors such as blockchain, the metaverse, or data centers. And in this way, I think we can try to come up with a more holistic approach that marries different legal fields in technology law going forward. In the last minute, let me just map out, before I stop, I promise, just three major pathways in which I see these fields evolving. What are some of the futures? Maybe you have some idea. Well, that's not the case. I suspect you have, but you just want this to be short and over. So law can just be a mere framework. And that would mean that the law basically is valuable, but it only shows you what you can or cannot do. And this is what the law sometimes does, but that's certainly not enough. We could also go down, I would say, a rabbit hole of a denormativized techno law. What does that mean? You know, as I said before, in these enforcement framework, we have this MAPS policy where that worked precisely well, and you could, identify apps that were exploiting certain data flows that weren't disclosed. And that's a nice marriage of law and technology, but it was not reflected upon properly in the sense of what does this do to the institution? What does this do to other frameworks? And so this can be effective, but it's still vulnerable, as, for example, the Dutch child benefit scandal showed, in which, so this is the positive example, but the Dutch child care benefit scandal is the scandal that forced the entire Dutch government to resign. And that was precisely built on an algorithm that in the end went on unchecked and disfavored heavily migration, people with a migration background, people from marginalized communities that took their lives apart. Some committed suicide. And this is an example of how this can go wrong when you don't have a robust normative, ethical, and sociological discourse around this. So what I suggest is that we need this law and computer science only as a foundation layer, basically similar to a foundation model. And I'm going to skip this because it's just we're too much ahead of time. But it's interesting to think about this in the sense of discrimination frameworks. But here are many other disciplines that can come along, such as economics, sociology, psychology. And I think we have Fred Oswald on the call, who's one of the leading scholars in measurement science. Who's also a NIAC member and a member of RECSAI. And it would be great to team up with him, for example, on the question of how do we use frameworks that were developed for testing humans, and how do we extrapolate from this for testing advanced machines? And what can we learn from this, and what errors can we avoid? Or international relations and history. When we think about, again, the new center that we have here at Viadrina, what are the geopolitical consequences? And how do nations actually compete nowadays from a regulatory perspective about enabling and giving safe harbors to AI or prioritizing the protection of fundamental rights of their citizens? To answer all these questions, we founded this expert consortium. Of course, it will not answer all the questions, but it will host some conferences where hopefully people will talk about this in ways that are perhaps more succinct than I do, but at least going forward with some of these ideas that we sketched out today. So let me just conclude with a further 10 slides that will just basically be summed up by saying the future will be exciting. Thank you for being part of it, and thanks for being here. Oh. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we have foreseen right now is the possibility to ask questions. Now, I suspect that anybody who would ask a question might be crucified immediately, but those who are really hungry and thirsty could also just sneak out and go to the buffet right away. What? Sneak out? And maybe there are some questions that are urgent and need to be asked. John is on Zoom, and it's great to see you. Can you just briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll be happy to take your question.
Thank you so much, Philip. My name is John Elrose, and I'm from Sweden. I work with copyright speciality when it comes to generative AI, but the disruptiveness of AI in general. When it comes to, algorithms with the structure where they are trained, and can you have creative control of your production, and is it fair throughout the process? And I thought a lot about all of these aspects, because I think that in order for the Western world to really be thriving with human rights, we need to think about the geopolitical aspects. And the US Copyright Office, they have the reply comments tomorrow. So I'm going to write tomorrow about all of this that I've heard today. But other things I thought about as well, because the threat and possibility of automation, we are actually in a process now that can be resemblance to the early 19th century when it comes to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, when it comes to the Luddites. But we have to evolve from this. We have to take leadership and responsibility from this. Because if we don't do that in the EU, with the geopolitical situation, when the climate change and everything, then we won't have any future for this world. That's my prediction. Or the future will be grim, it's a Mad Max world. So my question is like this. For you, Philip, thank you so much, and the others also, for this very encouraging lecture from the north of Sweden, where I'm from. My question is, like, we have a populist right-wing discourse that pins people against each other, that creates a situation where we don't have class interests, we don't have organizations, we don't have the collective bargainings, we don't help the developing world either with climate funds, the World Bank and everything else. How can we change AI to be a benefit for a new kind of world order, where the Western world is not an imperialistic world order? So that's my thought, and that's what I'm going to work with when it comes to copyright, because I think generative AI will be the future if we don't have the Luddite mentality. So what's your take on this?
That's a great question. And I'm sure that many other scholars would like to rise and give their opinion on this. I would like to say that this is probably the question for another research symposium that we should hold very soon in the RECSAI, within the RECSAI environment. But just very briefly, I think you shared many true and say worrying thoughts about both the political and the environmental future of our world. There have been many scholars that have looked at this in much greater depth than I have. We have at our own ENS, we have Ulrike Klinger, who is one of the leading scholars worldwide on disinformation and frameworks of, answering questions such as, why do these technologies keep on adding insult to insult and insult to injury, let's say, and why do we have so much mainstreaming of right-wing media and others? So look at some of her papers and you'll find some answers. I myself would say that there has been an idea that has been put forward along the lines of, shuffling content, and this is something that we try to adapt to frameworks when it comes to market situations where we actually, with AI systems, can try to make sure that it's not always the same content that people are seeing. And of course, that's a very old idea, that you wanted to change the filter bubbles, or if they exist at all. But I think that there's some hope in having systems in place that are conveniently moderated in senses that you are presented with a greater variety of opinions rather than just ideological hegemony. And this is precisely, I think, a danger that we need to address, because as Krishnan said, if every company in a certain sector uses the same model, there's a chance they all get the same answers, they all get the same culture, and they will all miss out on the same things. And that holds true for the political processes as well. I will hold back here in the interest of time, hunger, and research, because I think we have other scholars that are better suited to answer this question. But thank you so much, John, and I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue on this.
Thank you so much, Philip, and likewise, inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you. all the best to the north or center of Sweden, wherever you're located at the moment. We have 2 questions. Maybe we collect them and we'll try to answer them jointly. So we have one by Julia and one by the lady in the blue pullover.
Yes.
Briefly introduce yourself, you can.
Yes, my name is Julia Reinhardt. I'm currently fellow at the ENS and at the invitation of Philipp Hacker. Thank you for that. And I'm by training, a political scientist, former diplomat, and I currently work on AI regulation with small and medium-sized AI companies at AI Campus Berlin. This is an introduction, but I have a very simple question, I hope, to you, and that is, I followed your work previous to this presentation quite a little bit over the last year, and I had the impression that more than here, you made a distinction between generative AI and other uses of AI, but you didn't do this in this presentation. Can you actually, like in a nutshell, say what the difference for you is? Is it possible to actually generalize it to and talk about generative AI and other uses of AI in one basket?
Excellent question. Then we take the second question directly, I think, from the lady in the blue pullover.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for that talk. I'm Waltraud Ritter. I'm in the German Internet Governance Forum. And at the recent IGF in Kyoto, the G7 AI process, particularly the Hiroshima process, was mentioned. And I was wondering whether you have looked at the OECD AI Observatory, because I do believe they tackle also the question of future ideas for sustainability and AI. And I think in terms of geopolitics, we should not forget about Japan and the G7. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. I fully agree. I have looked at the OECD publication. There's a really great report from the OECD. It's called the AI Footprint from 2022, and it's cited extensively in my paper. So that's absolutely true. And the OECD is leading some great works along these lines. And I'm also actually engaging. I'm part of the. Well, I advise some of the German ministries on the G7 process as well. So I'm familiar with that and that framework. The problem being, of course, that this is self-regulation, which has not had a great history so far, let's say, in technology regulation. Maybe that can change. I'm a little doubtful about this. We will know more about that tomorrow when we have the Trilogue Summit. Thank you, but that's an excellent question. To Julia, very briefly, yes, I think there is a difference. I left it out here for the sake of time. But the point being that as LLMs, large language models, get integrated into more and more societal processes, that has a deep, deep impact. It has been estimated that the environmental cost of a query, so if a single query to Google, say Googling for what's a good doctor or whatever in Frankfurt Oder, that goes up 10 times if you use an LLM instead of the normal AI that Google is using. And so if you think about the increasing integration of LLMs and generative AI more generally into all these search functionalities, that will have a massive impact. And that's actually part of what's driving the very estimates on this in this paper that says in 2027 we'll have the Argentina GHG emissions. That is based on a medium, on kind of a medium infiltration of LLMs into search and other frameworks. If there is a higher infiltration integration, it might even be higher. So that drives a lot of this, and actually tech visionaries and tech leaders are keenly aware of this because it just costs a lot of money. You get almost the same result and just costs a lot of money. At the moment, they're doing this for marketing, but I'm not sure that this is going to be sustainable either in financial and an environmental sense. So with this, many thanks. I think it is time to sustain ourselves in a physical sense. So then let us conclude this brief inaugural lecture and the launch. Thank you so much to all of you who have contributed to this. It's really a pleasure to see so many of you also online. I see Dora from Brazil. I see Stefan from Georgetown, Ramaya still, other members. Fred was there from Rice. We had people from Australia. It's wonderful to see this global society and this global network converging increasingly here in Frankfurt Oder. I think it's deeply necessary, and everybody should feel most welcome to join us here or online at our future events. Many thanks for coming and for listening. Now let's enjoy, engage, and let's dig in. Thank you.